I want to start off by emphasizing that the meaning of a word like gift is determined by its context. So the word gift, spelled G-I-F-T, in English means a present, but in German means a poison. So how do you know whether, if I say the word gift, whether I'm talking about a present or I'm talking about poison? Well, the way you know is by the context. So for instance, this class has been taught in English, and the class is at Loyola Marymount University in an English-speaking country. And so if we're in an English context and I say the word gift, you think it means present. Whereas if the whole class had been conducted in German and we're at a German university, if we were speaking German, the same word spelled the same way means poison. So the meaning of a word, indeed a meaning of a whole sentence, is in part dependent upon the context. So let's say you're out with your friends and your best friend spills a drink on you. You might say to your best friend, "I'm going to kill you," and you're laughing, and she's laughing, and everybody, it's very clear that's not a threat. Whereas in a different context, if a different person that you don't know comes up to you and pulls out a switchblade and says, "I'm going to kill you," well, that very obviously is a threat. So the meaning of a word, the meaning of a whole sentence is determined by the context. So what is the context of Genesis? Well, the context of Genesis is other stories of creation. Genesis was not written as a response to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. It is centuries and centuries and centuries before that. So if we were to read Genesis as if it were for or against evolution, that would be a little bit like reading Genesis to see if it's for or against iPhones, right? There's no way that Genesis is for or against iPhones. It's just not about iPhones because it's written centuries and centuries and centuries before anyone had an iPhone. So to look to the text of Genesis for an answer about iPhones is really to import a totally different context onto the story of Genesis. So what is the original context? Well, in the ancient world, there were a bunch of different creation stories. And one of the most prominent was the story of the Babylonians, which said that in the beginning, there was a great war among the gods. And some gods beat the other gods. And out of this chaos of war arose the world and the universe as we know it. Now, the story of Genesis is written as a rival story to this story of the Babylonians. And so once we understand that, we can understand what Genesis is actually trying to say, rather than getting caught up in misunderstandings of Genesis, as if Genesis were an early scientific text. It isn't an early scientific text. It's not trying to do science at all. And so therefore it's not failing to do science. So some people read Genesis and they get all wrapped up about, is this for or against evolution? But that is to radically misunderstand what Genesis is all about. So how does Genesis start? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this is arguably the most important, or at least one of the most important lines in Scripture. It actually is saying an enormous amount in just one sentence. So what is it saying? Well, before we get to that, let's consider a different question. Who created the creator? That's an example of a question that is, you might say, exhibiting the fallacy of a loaded question, right? In other words, your mother, you didn't kill your mother, right? Your mother's still alive. So when I ask you, after you killed your mother, where did you bury her? That's a loaded question that presupposes something that's not true, namely that you killed her mother and also that you buried her somewhere. And this question, who created the creator, is also a loaded question. In other words, it's a question with a false or disputed or question-begging supposition, namely that the creator was created. And so you might say, it's true metaphysically, right? Either a creator does not exist or a creator exists. Put it differently, either there really is a God or there's no God at all. If a creator does not exist, then no one created the creator. right? Because if the creator does not exist, the creator would be like a leprechaun or something, right? There's no such thing as leprechauns, so leprechauns weren't created by anyone. If, on the other hand, a creator does exist, then no one created the creator because the creator is the first cause, and therefore is there's nothing prior to the creator that's bringing about the creator. If atheism is true, this is a false or disputed question begging kind of question. And if theism is true, the same thing is the case. In any case, let's consider this verse from Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I'm drawing here on a great book by a Jewish thinker named Dennis Prager called Genesis, God, Creation, and Destruction. And he points out that this word for created, bara, implies that nothing aside from God previously existed. So we as human beings can make things, but God created time, space, and matter. That is to say, there's a difference between creating, which implies a radical originating of something, versus making. So I can make a cake because I can take pre-existing ingredients and put them together, right? Apple Computer Company can make a cell phone by taking things that already exist, like glass and plastic and whatever, and refashioning it, putting it together. But the idea of this verse is that God creates the heaven and earth, gives rise to time, space, and matter without pre-existing material. He also points out that the idea here is that God creates nature. What is the heavens and the earth? Well, it's the natural order. And God, therefore, is not part of nature. God is outside, you might say, of nature. In other words, nature is not God. And this is a very important point because many people thought of nature as being God, right? They thought of the sun and the moon and the stars and things like that as divine. So this is saying, well, no, nature is not really God. Nature, in other words, is not everything. And this corrects a contemporary belief that all that there is matter. If Genesis is correct, well, no, there's nothing before matter, outside of all created things, namely the creator. Another important point that Prager brings out is that according to Genesis, the act of creation is not sexualized. In many other ancient stories, you had creation as a result of sexual activity among the various gods. But this is showing not creation in that way. Creation is not the result of violence either, right? There's no war at the beginning of creation. In fact, there's not rival deities, rival gods at the beginning of creation. This story is saying there's only one God, and that God makes things not through an act of violence and also not through sexual acts, but God makes things in a different way. So what's happening here? We have, one way to think about it is what you have here is a kind of chaos in the beginning, right? You have darkness and it's deep and God's sort of hovering over the face of the waters. And so you have you might say a kind of initial disorder in a way. And so what happens next is, so notice here how God creates. So God is not creating through violence, right? He's not, the text doesn't say, one God beat up another God and out of this arose whatever. And also it's not an image of sexuality where two gods come together and give birth to, something else. Rather, God creates how? Through speech, right? God said, let there be light, and there was light. And what is speech? Well, what speech is reason made exteriorized. In other words, before you say anything, you first think it. And then what speech is making exterior your interior thought, right? Before you say a word, you think a word, and then your mouth expresses it or your hands type it up or whatever. So the idea here is that God creates through reason. God creates through rational speech. And rational speech is what? Rational speech is orderly. The reason you can understand my words is that I'm putting the words in order. If I just were to blurt out a bunch of words or just make a bunch of sounds, you wouldn't be able to understand it as rational speech. Rational speech, by its nature, is intelligible. Rational speech, by its nature, is orderly. And so that's how God creates. And so the creation reflects something of who God is, that is intelligent, able to speak, and the creation itself reflects an orderliness, an intelligibility. It's not, in other words, a chaotic, random, violent mess of stuff, is what the story is saying. God saw the light was good. And this is a phrase we'll see many times throughout the text, that what God makes is good. The idea is that creation is good. The text is already implying that creation is orderly. The text is already implying that creation is intelligible. And now the text is saying very explicitly that creation is good. And it goes through not just saying light is good, but all the different things that God makes are good, right? All the different animals, and the sun and the moon and the stars and human beings. God is making sure that there is order, that light is separated from darkness, that things are in the right place. And this is true also, you might say, for us today, right? No one's life, I imagine, in this class is pure light, nothing but goodness, everything's wonderful and perfect. And I hope no one in this class has a life that's utter darkness, that they don't know anything and they're wandering around without any light at all. Each one of us has a sort of, you might say, a combination of both of these elements. God calls things by name. Part of what God does in rational speech is to create, but here in rational speech, God also names things. And we'll see later that the image of God, which is human beings, also has this power of naming, power of categorizing things. And we have here also this idea of one day. Now, some people think that the story of Genesis and evolution are in contradiction because the story of Genesis talks about everything being created in 7 days, but evolution tells us that everything was created over millions and millions and millions of years. But this conflict is actually illusionary. In reality, the word day in the Hebrew Bible, like the word day in contemporary English, is used in two different ways. So in English, if I say, there was one day where I met my wife, and I could also say, back in my day, when I was in high school, people didn't have cell phones. Now I'm using the word day there in two different senses. So it is true in English, in one sense of day, it does mean 24 hours. But day can also be used in the sense of back in my day. And if you understand that sense of the term, what you mean is not that you went to high school for one day, but rather at that time period. Back in my day, when I was in high school, we didn't have cell phones. That's a different sense of day. So too, in the Hebrew scriptures, day is sometimes used to mean 24 hours, but is often used in the sense it is here to mean just an indiscriminate amount of time, just some time. So it's a mistake, I think, to think of day as meaning 24 hours. In the Catholic tradition, at least, most interpreters of scripture, Augustine, Aquinas, John Henry Newman, John Paul II, Pope Francis, have not understood day to mean 24 hours. Well, I think the significance is seen in light of the other ancient stories of creation. So basically, those stories held that the sun was a god and that the moon and the stars were gods. And so this story is saying, no, that's wrong. The sun is not divine. The sun is just a created object. This moon is not divine. The stars are not divine. They too are created by God. So this story is, in other words, correcting a view that's very common throughout the world, that the heavenly bodies, the stars and the moon and the sun are divine beings. This is saying, no, they're not. They're created also. And next we get to perhaps one of the most important. In other ancient stories, the idea was that there are some people made in the image of God. That would be the king and the king's son. And everybody else was not made in the image of God. This story is correcting that view. This story is saying whether you're a king or a commoner, whether you're a prince or a peasant, whether you're male or female, everybody is made in the image and likeness of God. The view here actually is incredibly important, in part because centuries and centuries later, it gave rise to the idea of human rights. The idea of human rights is that all human beings, male, female, young, old, everybody deserves respect. Everybody deserves protection. Everybody is someone who has intrinsic value. So, this idea of being in the image of God is incredibly important in terms of the history and the development of basic human rights. Be fruitful and multiply. If human beings are really good, if they're really made in God's image, then it's a good thing that human beings be fruitful and multiply. They're called to fill the earth and subdue it. And subdue it doesn't mean dominate it, it means govern it, as you might say a gardener cares for the environment that the gardener is gardening. The idea here, though, is that to create new human beings is a good thing because you're participating, you might say, in an activity that God participated in. God himself made human beings, and when we make new human beings, we're doing a kind of divine activity. Well, dominion's not domination, so it's not saying exploit the earth, destroy it, do whatever you want. But dominion also doesn't mean subjugation, as if we should never cut down a tree, even if we need it in order to make a house in order to live. So human beings are supposed to have this sort of a middle ground, you might say, between exploitation on the one hand and subjugation of nature on the other hand. To understand what this is talking about, we have to put it in context again. In many ancient stories, the created world, the material world, was seen as evil, was seen as bad. The basic idea for many of these stories is that there's two fundamental forces, a light side and a dark side, kind of like the force. And the idea is the dark side of the force is responsible for all the material world that we see. And the light side of the force is the spiritual, the non-visible. This story is correcting that. It's saying, no, the things we see, the created order, the sun, the moon, and the stars, the plants, and the animals, all these things, including human beings, are very good. All right, so the seventh day. Again, it's a mistake, I think, to read the seventh day in a ahistorical sort of way. This is not, let me say that again, this is not a text that's trying to do contemporary science. This is a creation story that's using poetry to try to give us wisdom about what it is to be a human being. So it's not a scientific text. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's very important, but it's not trying to do science. So what is meant there by the seventh day? Well, the text so far has tried to convey to us the idea that the universe is orderly. You have time and space and life created on the first, second, and third day. You have various realms, in other words, of day and night, sea and sky, and land and vegetation. Then on day 4, 5, and 6, you have various rulers, the sun and the moon to rule over the day and the night, the birds to rule over the sky, the fish over the sea, and man and animals over land and vegetation. The idea, in other words, is an orderly cosmos. And what is the seventh day all about? Well, the seventh day is a kind of play on words, because the Hebrew word for seven is also the Hebrew word for to make a covenant. So the idea is that all the cosmos is in a relationship with God, that God didn't just make the world and let it go like a watchmaker letting go a watch, but rather God is in an ongoing relationship with the entire created order. He's talking about the creation of human beings. And the idea is that that human beings, you and me, we are a combination. We're not just dust. We're not just matter. We're not just material. We also are the breath of life, you might say, the spirit, the soul. And so to think of us as just a soul is to make a mistake. That's to think of us like we're an angel. But also to think of us as if we were just material is also a mistake. We're not just dust. We're not just an animal. We're a combination of matter and spirit. We're a combination of body and soul. And to reduce us to either one is to make a mistake in understanding our fundamental human nature. So human beings are given from the very beginning work. Work is there before the fall. Work is there in the Garden of Eden. The original man is meant to till and keep it. So he has some meaningful activity to do. And this makes sense if human beings are made in the image of God, because God does not just sit in heaven and do nothing. What does God do? God creates. We just got done talking about that. So God is active, you might say. He's working, he's providing something. And so human beings are called to be active and to work and to provide. Well, if I say to you, I have knowledge all the way from A to Z, or I have knowledge all the way of the United States from one coast to the other coast, from Alaska down to the tip of Florida or whatever. All those would be ways of saying I have complete knowledge. So if we say I have knowledge of good and evil, that's one way of saying I have knowledge from one extreme of goodness all the way to the other extreme of evil. That is to say, I have complete and perfect knowledge. Now, who has complete and perfect knowledge, do you think, at least according to the story of Genesis? So what is this saying? This is saying if you eat of the knowledge from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in other words, if you try to get complete and perfect knowledge, that's another way of saying you try to become God. Now, what's wrong with trying to become God? Well, let's put it differently. What would be wrong, do you think, with you trying to become a dog? What would happen? Imagine that you made it your life's goal and you said, I'm going to try to become a dog. What would happen to you, do you think? Well, you could get on all fours, right? You would never really become a dog. And what else would happen to you if you actually did all those things? Would you have a good life, do you think? Well, if you did that, what would happen is you would miss out on human food, right? Because all you eat is dog food. You'd miss out on human friendships. You would miss out on going to human movies and reading human books and having human conversations and having a human family and having human children and having a human marriage. You'd miss out on all those good things that come along with pursuing goods of being human. Now, the same thing is true if you were to try to become God. You can't really become God, because if God is the first cause, of course you can't be the first cause. And you're not eternal, and you're not all-knowing, and you're not all-powerful, and you never could be any of those things, could you? So what would happen to you if you tried to become God? Well, we know from experience, there's all kinds of people in history who have tried to become God. Every dictator who's ever walked the face of the earth wanted absolute power, wanted to be in charge, wanted to be God, wanted to be divine. And what happens? Well, can they become God? Of course they can't. And what happens typically is that they make themselves and everyone around them completely miserable. God makes human beings good, but God also gives human beings freedom. And that's part of what's going on here, is that Adam and Eve are both given freedom. Now, why did God give people freedom? Well, God gave people freedom presumably because God wanted there to be love in the universe. And if a being is not free, then that being can't really love. So think of a tree. A tree can't really love you, right? Because it's just doing what trees do. A rock can't really love you. You know, a wild animal can't really love you. So in order for someone to really love you, that individual has to be free. But if you're free, you're also free to misuse the good things you have. So for instance, it's a good thing that you have hands. It'd be really sad if, you got your hands cut off. But you can misuse a good thing, right? You could take your hands and you could strangle me to death. You could take your hands and grab a gun and shoot people to death. So good things can be misused, can be freely misused. So the story is about this human tendency, you might say, to try to become God, to become like God, to be totally in charge, to overrun, you might say, any limits on their conduct. So that's what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about. So what is the man doing here? He's made in the image of God, and he is imitating God, right? God named the sun and the moon and the stars. Now this human being is naming the beasts of the field, etc. So Adam's looking around at all these animals, and he sees that there's no animal that is a companion for him, a partner for him. No one who is his. Eve is made from the rib of Adam. And what does that mean? Well, Aquinas said, if Eve had been made from the head of Adam, then Eve would have been his leader and commander. If Eve had been made from the foot of Adam, then she would have been his slave and subordinate. But Eve was made from the rib of Adam to be his equal and his companion. So the idea is that Adam and Eve, man and woman, share the same flesh. They're made of the same stuff. They're made of the same substance. In some of the other creation stories, women were made from a totally different substance. And some people think, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. They're totally different. Well, this text is saying, well, no, they're fundamentally, in terms of human nature, the same. The union of man and woman is a deliberate divine intervention, you might say, according to the story. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that men and women come together. And look at how the creation of man and woman is before the fall. It's God who brings together the man and the woman before there's any fall. And then what happens next? Well, some interpreters have noticed that what Adam says to Eve, what the first man says to the first woman, is that he comments on her body. This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. He, in other words, he appreciates her beauty. You have then erotic love, erotic attraction existing before the fall. Erotic love and erotic attraction, the attraction of man to woman, and implicitly at least for woman to man, is not a punishment, is not the result of a fall, but is a result of creation. So this is the first marital advice, that the man leaves his father and mother and prefers his wife to father or mother. They become one flesh. That's another way of talking about they become one in terms of reproductive act, the sexual act. They join their flesh together. If you think about being naked in front of someone, I imagine there's relatively few people that you'd be comfortable doing that in front of. Why? Well, because you presumably are worried about being judged. You want to hide and cover up in front of most people, if not all people. And you feel that you can't be totally at ease and open and unguarded. So the text, in other words, is saying that Adam and Eve are in harmony. They don't need to defend themselves against each other. They don't need to worry about being judged. They are, in other words, in a situation in which their relationship is so good that they feel totally comfortable and unguarded with one another. And so they're in a way the way we were when we were little kids. I mean, when you were 2 years old or 1 year old, right, you'd run around naked in the front yard in the sprinkler in the summer, and you wouldn't care one bit. And there could be 20 people standing there, and you'd be like, whatever. You did not care at all about running around naked because you're someone who at that stage was not concerned about defending yourself, not concerned about being judged. So there is something going on here. There's a serpent in there. And the serpent is in the garden. The serpent, you might say, represents an element of chaos, which is inextricable from the human community. It exists necessarily. And what happens? What does the serpent do? Well, the serpent gets into the walled garden. The serpent, in other words, is an element of chaos in an otherwise orderly place. Because what is a walled garden? That's what Eden means, a walled garden. Well, a walled garden is a kind of orderly place, right? The wall keeps things out. The garden is tended to by Adam. Things are in their proper place, etc. But chaos can't help but enter in. You can't get rid of chaos in the human condition. The serpent questions whether God is stingy. The serpent's saying, in other words, God is trying to hold you back, right? Did he take away all the fruit from all the trees in the garden? He's trying to ruin your fun. He's trying to undermine your well-being. Well, this is arguably a threat. The serpent is saying in this next passage, if you eat of this fruit, you won't die. But if you refuse to eat of the fruit, you will die. So when we think of the serpent, I think one of the scripture scholars I read in thinking about this text says we shouldn't think about a little gardener snake. This is like a big, ferocious, scary Komodo dragon that is very intimidating and very lethal. And so when the serpent says, "You will not die," it's like a Hell's Angels biker with the switchblade out, pulls out the switchblade, puts it to your throat, and says, "If you give me your keys, you won't die." But the threat is, right? If you don't give me your keys, you will die. I'm going to kill you. So what happens next? So to be like God, remember the tree is all about the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, perfect knowledge, divine knowledge. And the serpent's saying, hey, you should eat of the fruit. You'll be like God. Timothy Keller once said that the underlying and ultimate motive of all sin is to be like God. It's the sin beneath sin. If you think about it, anytime someone does something wrong, they want to be like God, right? They want to create the universe the way they want it. They want to transgress the rules that they think other people say they should obey, and they want to create their own rules. They want to be in ultimate charge. So what happens then? It looks good, right? The tree was good for food. It's going to taste great. And that it's going to make us wise. We're going to be better than other people now. The idea that the story is using poetic language, but the story is telling a story that's repeated countless times every single day. The idea is, I want what I want, and if that is something that is against what God wants, well, tough luck. I want to be God. I want to make the rules. I want to be in charge. So she eats of the fruit, and then, so note how there's a kind of debate sometimes about who is worse, Adam or Eve. I think arguably Adam was worse, because Eve at least sort of resisted the temptation. She sort of argued with the serpent. She didn't give in right away, but Adam just gives in right away. And he, after all, was given the command by God not to eat of the fruit. Eve wasn't given directly that command. So arguably, Adam is showing himself even worse than Eve. The eyes of both were opened. Now, does this mean that they didn't have eyesight before? It can't be that they were physically blind, because remember it said earlier the woman saw the fruit was good to eat. So it's not about like they were blind and then they could see. The eyes of both were open. What does that mean? Well, they experienced something new. When you do evil, you can experience something new. I know about evil theoretically, like I know what murder is, but because I've never murdered anyone, I don't know what it feels like to be a murderer. The eyes of both were opened. They experienced doing evil. And their eyes were opened in another way too. They knew that they were naked. They knew that they were vulnerable. And therefore, they knew how to harm each other. Because once you realize that you're naked and you know how you're vulnerable, you know how to harm other people. So what did they do? They covered up. They didn't want to be vulnerable to each other anymore. They didn't want to be totally open with each other anymore. They saw each other as threats. The man against the woman against the man. They better protect themselves from each other. And so that's what they began to do. When they do wrong, what do? They hide. How many of you, when you do wrong, go on social media and post, hey, I just wanted to let you guys know I cheated on my boyfriend. I cheated on my girlfriend. I was mean to my best friend. I mean, do you ever do that? Do you trumpet the things you do that are wrong? Or do you hide them? Do you put them away so that hopefully no one knows? You find a kind of defensiveness. You find I better keep my distance. I better cover up. I better not be, fully open. I want to hide from God. I want to hide from my partner. So you do see some of that in this text, that's for sure. If God is all-knowing, why in the world would God say to Adam, where are you? So according to the story, right? God just created the heavens and the earth. He's amazing. He's so powerful. And then now he can't find a human being? That seems sort of weird. I think the where are you is not, I can't find you, Adam, because I just can't see you. Where are you? But more that where are you really means, what are you doing? So God says, where are you? What is he really saying? He's not saying, I can't figure out your location. what God is saying here is, what is your actions? What is it that you've done? What is your problem? That's sort of the question he's asking. And this is even more clear when the next part here. So Adam says, hey, I heard you and I was afraid of you. That seems kind of weird. So in the story so far, what's happened? God has created Adam. That seems like a good thing. Then God, put all these animals and fruits and trees and stuff. That's a good thing. And then God makes a beautiful woman for Adam. So God has given Adam all these good things. Why in the hell would Adam be afraid of God? That seems weird, right? I mean, if I were some guy who had given you just like amazing things, like I'm like, hey, I want to buy you a brand new car. Hey, I want to pay for your tuition. Hey, I want to give you a beach house in Malibu. And then the next time you saw me, would you be scared of me? I mean, right? I mean, would you? No, I would think the next time you saw me, you'd be like overjoyed to see me. This guy just gave me amazing stuff. Here he is again. Wow, this is great. When am I going to get it now? So what happens, in other words, what happens is the story is saying something like this. When we sin, what happens is the person who should be most lovable to us and most enjoyable to us no longer is. He's not happy to see God. He's scared of God now. So then what happens? This is like the question that a mom would ask a kid who's gotten into the chocolate cookies, and the kid has chocolate cookies all over his face. And the mom says, did you get into the cookies? Now, why does the mom do that? It's not because the mom doesn't know that the kid got into the cookies. It's completely obvious. There are cookie crumbs all over the kid's face. The reason the mom asks that is the mom wants the kid to be honest. The mom wants the kid to come clean and tell the truth and reestablish an honest relationship. So Adam says, God, I am so sorry for eating the thing which you commanded me not to eat. Adam says, I really apologize. I confess that I'm totally wrong. What he does is he blames God. God, the woman you gave to me, it's your fault, God, and it's her fault. He blames his wife and he blames God. So in other words, what does he do? He does exactly what so many people do now when they get caught doing something evil. How many people today, when they're caught doing something evil, blame the government or blame economic system or blame, the powers that be? It's not their fault. It's somebody else's fault. So this story, in other words, is a human story. It's about things that many of us still do today. We want to be God. We want to be in charge. We do something wrong, and we blame everybody else but ourselves. We don't take responsibility. So what happens next? God is asking this question, not so much to get information, but to hopefully elicit a honest confession. God wants to restore the relationship that's been broken. And to do that, we have to be honest. And this is true of any relationship. If I do something horrible to you, I slap you in the face and I deny it happened, well, how can we ever be restored to a good relationship? If we're going to be restored, I have to be honest. I have to say, I did something wrong. I have to say, I apologize. I'm very sorry. I should not have done that. So what does Eve say? Does Eve say, I'm really sorry. It's my fault. I shouldn't have done that? No. She's like Adam. Not quite as bad as Adam, because Adam blamed her also. But Eve passes the buck. The story of Adam and Eve, you might say, is a story of Daniela, and it's a story of Kat, and it's a story of Laura, and it's a story of Christopher and Albina. It's all of us. Adam and Eve, in other words, are not just two people long ago. Adam and Eve are every man and every woman. who in their own way recreate the story. The forbidden fruit may not be, in our case, a fruit. It might be tax evasion. It might be lying to a friend. It might be harming someone. It might be failing to do what we know we should do. But whatever form the apple takes, can any of us really say that we're totally innocent? That we never eat of the forbidden fruit? That we're just perfect? The story is indicative of human nature. It's teaching us very important truths about the nature of being human. There's going to be an enmity, tension, a fighting between the serpent and the woman, between her offspring and his offspring. You have, in other words, a foreshadowing of what's going to come later in this text, where you see a woman who is at war with the serpent. You may recognize this image. It's called Our Lady of Guadalupe. And you see a woman stomping on a serpent. From a different culture, but same idea. The woman is stomping on the serpent below. What is the idea here? From yet another culture. This is the United States. This is the Golden Dome at the University of Notre Dame. And this is kind of a famous image, but you see at the bottom is what? This woman stomping on the serpent. So this is important because in some creation stories, women are seen as the origin of evil. But in this creation story, the woman is seen as ultimately the source of the end of evil, of stomping on the serpent, of overcoming evil. This is part of, so the idea is something like this, that God creates beings that have freedom. Apparently the serpent has freedom, certainly man and woman have freedom, but freedom can be misused, right? And so then you might say, well, why did God make people free? He could have just made, God could have reigned over a kingdom of chemicals, and chemicals just always do whatever they do. But if God didn't make free beings, well, then there couldn't be love. For there to be love in the world, there needs to be free beings that can choose to love and therefore also choose not to love. What's going on here? So you guys may be aware that human beings are distinctive in that there is a cephalopelvic disproportion when women give birth. That is to say that the heads of babies are large, and therefore giving birth to babies is difficult. And women also, or children also are born in a very vulnerable state for human beings. There's many other creatures that they're born and pretty much right away they get up on their own and they go off. So think of, say, horses. They get born and almost immediately a little baby horse can get up and run away. Well, human babies obviously don't do that, right? They can't walk for months and months and months. So what happens? Well, what happens is that there's a natural bond, you might say, between women and their babies. In every culture, women love their babies and want to take care of their babies. So what happens then is in a situation where there's disorder and sin, what's going to happen is men are going to take advantage of that. And that's this idea of he shall rule over you. Not that it's good or that this is the way it ought to be, but in fact, if there's chaos and violence and disorder and sin, the stronger are going to rule over the weaker. And if things come down to brute strength, most men are physically stronger than most women. And so you're going to have a situation in which there is patriarchy, that is, men ruling over women, especially women who have small children, because small children, of course, can't defend themselves at all. And if women are trying to defend themselves against a man and also try to defend their child, it's going to be very, very challenging indeed. So there's also a punishment for the man. So work becomes drudgery, becomes a difficulty. Adam has to work to get the bread that he's going to eat. And then he was taken from the dust, and to dust he shall return. So this is talking about a fact of human mortality. We're not the only creatures that die, but we're the only creatures on earth that know that we're going to die. All of us, once we reach the age of reason, know that we're heading towards death. And there's nothing that we can do about it. We can try to delay it, but we know sooner or later, death is going to come to us, and we're going to return to dust. So the story of Adam and Eve is, again, a universal story that's meant to tell us truths about each one of us. Now, what are those truths? Not truths about whether evolution is true or false, but truths like we're all mortal. Truths like when we sin, we turn away from each other. Truths like the universe is orderly. Truths like our harmony between man and woman is compromised when we do wrong. The story of Genesis, in other words, is a story of perennial human wisdom.